Professor Kaku, I want to thank you for this interesting lecture. It was very interesting. And I have one question. Today you told us about all our world medicine money that will be digitalized in future. And to your mind, how many years should pass our mind to our brain to be digitalized? And will human extinct like a biological species like dinosaurs and transform into a form of cyborgs of simply in some form of digitalized form of life? Thank you.
Okay, the question is, will we digitalize the mind? That will take maybe 100 years. Now, realize that today there are two great mysteries of science. The first mystery is the universe. Where the universe came from, where the universe is going. That's the first great mystery. The second great mystery is the mind. Sitting on your shoulders is 3 pounds. These 3 pounds of tissue are the most complicated object in the solar system. Perhaps in this sector of the Milky Way galaxy, your brain is the most complex object known to science. But we're children trying to understand the human brain. That's why President Obama and the European Union have allocated billions of euros to try to understand the pathways of the brain. And they say it may take 50 years. 50 years just to get a map of the brain. But maybe in 100 years, it will be possible to make a backup copy of your mind. Okay? So you 2.0, okay? That may be possible, I can't say for sure. In which case, some people think we will become immortal. We will live forever as a CD-ROM, as a backup copy. Now, I don't know. All I know is that governments are now taking this very seriously. Billions of euros will be allocated to understand the human mind, but it will take many, many decades. And we will have many decades to debate the ethical questions of whether or not we should enhance ourselves. Right now, we can connect the brain to a mechanical arm that is stronger than a human. This has already been done. We can communicate the brain to legs and create Iron Man. Iron Man is already a distinct possibility. And then with genetic engineering, we may want to enhance ourselves to become a little bit smarter, perhaps better looking, who knows? These are questions that only society can answer. And how do we answer these questions? We need wisdom. But where does wisdom come from? Wisdom comes from vigorous democratic debate among informed people. That's where wisdom comes from. And that's why I write books. That's why I do television, to stimulate the debate about these big questions that face us in the future. How far do we want to enhance ourselves? Do we want to become supermen, superwomen? That is a possibility. But we have to democratically discuss this among ourselves, and that's where wisdom comes from. Wisdom comes from vigorous debate among informed people. And hopefully that's what I do with my life.
So some people say, you cannot predict the future. You can't even predict the past. Nobody predicted the crash of 2008. Well, that's not quite true. You see, what is the origin of wealth? Where does prosperity and wealth come from? Ultimately, it comes from science. But science comes in waves. One invention, the steam invention, creates a cascade of secondary invention which creates wealth, fantastic wealth. And wealth often creates a bubble, a huge bubble. And when it pops, you get a depression. So before talking about the future, let's talk about the past. Around 1800, we physicists worked out the thermodynamics of steam engines. From that, we could compute how much energy it would take to create a locomotive. That created textile mills. That created factories, railroads, tremendous wealth that we had never seen before. For the first time in history, there was a bubble. a huge bubble that formed on the London Stock Exchange, and the bubble was unsustainable, and it popped in 1850. In fact, the crisis of 1850 was so great that it even gave birth to a philosophy called Marxism. We physicists are restless too. 80 years later, we pioneered the next great invention: electricity, magnetism, the internal combustion engine. And that created a second bubble, a tremendous bubble on the American Stock Exchange in utility stocks and automobile stocks. The bubble was unsustainable, and it popped in 1929. 80 years. 80 years later, we physicists created the next set of wealth: lasers, computers, transistors, the internet. And it created a bubble, a huge bubble. And the bubble in the United States was in real estate, and it popped in 2008. And even as we speak in this room, this month, there's a bubble in Europe that probably will also pop. And that bubble was created to maintain the Mediterranean lifestyle. Well, that is also unsustainable, and it will pop sometime this year. So the question that we physicists are asking, and this is the question: what is the fourth wave? The first wave was steam power. The second wave was electricity. The third wave was high tech. The fourth wave, we're not sure. But we think it's going to be a combination. Hold on a second. We think it's going to be a combination of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and nanotechnology.
Another question from the front row.
Dr. Kaku, thank you very much for visit to Ukraine, and my question will be the following. Do you think that these new technologies mentioned in your lecture and video are simply widening the gap between rich countries and the people and nations who have this access to the technologies and those who do not?
Good question. First
you.
of all, the question was, will we have a digital rich and digital poor? Well, 10 years ago in America, there was a big debate about that question. Nobody debates that anymore, because the answer is obvious. The people who are connected are children, poor children. If you are a poor kid and you are not on Facebook, you are not on Twitter, you don't exist. You don't exist. People don't know you. Who are you? You're not on Facebook. You're not on Twitter. And so access was not the problem. We have Moore's Law. We have mass production. Things get cheaper every year. The problem is not access. The problem is jobs. The job market is changing. And it's changing from commodity capital more towards intellectual capital. Realize that if your country only produces food, let's say, food prices get cheaper every decade. On average, food prices, their commodity, get cheaper every year. This morning you had breakfast that the Tsar of Russia could not have had 100 years ago. Think of what you had for breakfast. The King of England could not have eaten your breakfast 100 years ago. That's the process that commodities can be mass produced. But the brain cannot be mass produced. This means that talent, imagination, experience, leadership, creativity, that cannot be mass produced. And that's what we have in this room. Every revolution has winners and losers. You are among the winners. Because what's inside this room? Inside this room are the future leaders, the future thinkers, the future opinion makers, the people who are educated, the people who have imagination, innovation, experience, leadership. That's what's in this room. And people like you will thrive in the future. Unfortunately, nations which will be poor in the future are nations which only rely on agriculture. Commodities, you have to be careful. Some commodities, of course, like oil, rise in price. But on average, commodities like food fall in price. So nations which will be poor in the future are nations which do not understand that capitalism is making a transition from commodity capital more towards intellectual capital, and that's what we have here in this room.
Learn a subject. The stress should not be on rote memorization. It should be on concepts, principles, and physical pictures. We all know from college that as soon as you take a certain course that you know is kind of irrelevant, that as soon as you walk out that exam room, you forget everything. You forget everything. Why? Because you know you're never going to use it ever again in your life. Kids are smart. They know what courses are really useful and courses which are not. And in courses that are not so useful, they'll memorize the material and then forget everything the next day. But principles stay with you for the rest of your life. Physical principles, like for example, why does it rain? When I was a kid, I learned that it rained because when hot air hits cold air, at the border between them, it was Benjamin Franklin who showed that clouds form and eventually it rains. That stayed with me for the rest of my life. Every time I watch the news and I watch the weather report, I look for the collision of hot air and warm air. Why? Because it is a physical principle. That's what we should be stressing. Physical principles, pictures, and not memorization. So do we have to memorize some things? Yeah, we got to memorize addition, subtraction. We do have to pay our dues. But that should not be the stress. For example, my daughter in New York State had to take the Regents exam in geology. So I thought it was going to be a nice exam about the principles of geology. How many principles of geology are there? A handful. Tectonic movements, earthquakes, the different waves of earthquakes, and also, a few crystals. So I looked at the exam. The exam was nothing but spitting out the names of all the crystals, all the minerals, and no principles at all. I felt like ripping up that exam. In fact, my daughter came up to me afterwards and said, "Daddy, why does anyone want to become a scientist?" And I felt humiliated. There I was, a scientist. My own kid was saying, why should anyone want to become a scientist? If that's all it is, memorizing the names of all the minerals, memorizing the names of all the crystals, but not stressing the principles, only a handful of them, the principles of tectonic activity, the principles of the recycling of rock. There are not that many principles that drive geology, but that's not what they tested on the exam. So you're right. We have to pay our dues. We have to learn some things, but that should not be the focus of learning in college.
There are crazy people out there because the universe is crazy. If form and content, if appearance and essence were the same thing, there'd be no necessity for science. The whole purpose of science is to see the difference between appearance and essence. In other words, the universe is crazy. In fact, it is crazier than we can even imagine. Who would have thought we would have quantum mechanics? Who would have thought we could have dead cats and live cats existing simultaneously? Who would have thought that you could be in many places at the same time? That's called craziness. It's also called modern physics.
Well, after such a great introduction, I can't wait to hear the speaker myself. And first time, also let me say that sometimes all these accolades can backfire. Recently, New York Magazine voted me as one of the 100 smartest people in New York. And I thought, wow, what an honor. Later, however, I have to confess, later I found out that Madonna also made that same list. And they told me that next year Lady Gaga is going to push me off the list entirely. What can I say? Well, today I'm going to talk about the future of the mind. And of course, it's very dangerous to talk about the future. Let me quote from that great philosopher of the Western world, Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra once said, quote, "Prediction is awfully hard to do, especially if it's about the future." Well, I'm a physicist. We can predict the evolution of the universe billions of years from now. So let me quote from that other great philosopher of the Western world, Woody Allen. Woody Allen once said, quote, "Eternity is an awful long time, especially toward the end." Well, I'm a physicist. What does a physicist do? Well, we invented the transistor. We invented the laser. We helped to assemble the first computer and the internet. We wrote the World Wide Web. And along the way, we also invented television. We invented radio, radar, microwaves, and don't forget, we helped to create the space program and the GPS system. And we physicists love to make predictions. When we helped to assemble the internet, one physicist predicted that the internet would become a forum of high culture, high art, and high society. Well, today we know that 5% of the internet is pornography. But that's because teenage boys log on to the internet. Just wait until the grandmas and grandpas log on to the internet. Then 50% of the internet will be pornography. Now, before we begin a discussion of what sits on your shoulders, something that weighs 3 pounds and is the most complex object in the universe. Before I begin a discussion, you may be saying to yourself, well, what's the difference between a physicist, a chemist? Well, let me tell you a little story. During World War II, the Nazis captured a group of American scientists and called them spies, and they were going to be executed by firing squad. So they put up a geologist, a physicist, and a chemist about to be fired away by execution. Well, they aimed their rifles at the geologist. And the geologist suddenly said, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" Well, in the chaos, the geologist snuck away and escaped. Well, now it was the physicist's time to have him shot. So the Nazis raised their rifles at the physicist. And then the physicist said, "Lightning! Lightning!" And again, chaos, everyone ran off, and the physicist escaped. And now it was the chemist's turn. They turned their rifles at the chemist, and the chemist said, "Fire! Fire!" Now, we're going to talk about the brain today. And if we were to duplicate the brain using hardware, computer hardware, it would occupy a city block of blue gene computers, some of the most advanced on the earth. The energy consumption would be that of a nuclear power plant, a gigawatt of power, and it would take a river to cool it down. And your brain, however, only consumes 20 watts of power. So when someone calls you a dim bulb, that is a compliment. And your brain doesn't require a nuclear power plant to energize it, just a few hamburgers. So how is it possible? And now, because of modern physics, we've learned more in the last 5 to 10 years than in all of human history. You know, when I was a kid, I used to love reading science fiction. I read about telepathy, that is, reading minds. I read about telekinesis, moving objects with the mind. I read about recording memories. I read about photographing dreams. However, I tried very hard to read people's minds, and I finally came to the conclusion that maybe telepaths do exist, but I wasn't one of them. Well, today we can do all of the above. I will show you how we photograph thoughts, photograph dreams. One day you will push the play button and see the dream you had the previous night. I will show you how we can record memories, about how we can move objects with the mind and read minds. All this because of advanced physics just in the last 5 to 10 years. And this is my previous book, a New York Times bestseller. They used to say that the word physics would never, ever enter the New York Times bestseller list. I did it not once, but twice. Physics of the impossible goes not just 50 years into the future, it goes 500 years into the future. When we might have starships, we might have teleportation, we might even have time machines. And in this book, I answer the question, according to Einstein's theory, is it possible to go backwards in time and meet your teenage mother before you're born and she falls in love with you? Well, if your teenage mother falls in love with you before you're born, you're in deep doo-doo if that happens. Well, there's a lot of interest in the mind because I'm proud to announce that my book, The Future of the Mind, is now number 4 on both the Barnes & Noble and the Amazon list of bestsellers in the United States. So it's already, and it's only been out for 1 week. So the two greatest mysteries in the universe. One of them is the origin of the universe, which is what I do for a living. I'm the co-founder of string field theory. And one day we hope that string theory will answer the question, why did we have a Big Bang anyway? The other great mystery is what sits on your shoulders, the most complex object known to science for the first time in history now, revealing its innermost secrets. And you probably heard President Barack Obama in last year's State of the Union address shocked the scientific community by announcing the Brain Initiative. You realize that the Human Genome Project, it only cost $3 billion. It mapped all the genes of our body, and it has opened up huge areas of genetics and medicine. The next big project already devoted $1 billion from the European Union and the United States government into this project is the Brain Project, to create a map of every single neuron in your body, which means that one day we will understand mental illness, one of the greatest afflictions of humanity, and perhaps even create not just a disk of the genome, but a disk containing your connectome. Every single neuron, all your memories, your desires, your hopes, dreams, encoded in a connectome. And if you have your genome and your connectome on two disks, and you put them together, then you may even have, in some sense, a form of immortality. This raises theological, ethical, religious questions. Who are you anyway? If you die, but your genome survives, and we can revive your body anytime, if we can bring back your consciousness at any time, then did you really die? This raises all sorts of questions about who are we? Are we nothing but information? So when I was a kid, I used to try to read people's thoughts. I would concentrate real hard to see whether or not I could be a telepath like we see in science fiction. Ultimately, I realized that all this is bunk. Without physics, you cannot read the mind. And then there's the movie The Matrix, where reality itself is nothing but an uploaded software program. Everything you see around you is fake. This is The Matrix. In fact, let me ask you a question. Late at night, just before you go to sleep, have you ever had that weird, bizarre thought that maybe The Matrix is right? Maybe the reality you see is an illusion. Maybe it's a software program. Maybe you are the only one that's really real. Ever had that thought late at night? And maybe it's all a test to see whether you're smart enough to figure it out, that everything you see is nothing but an uploaded memory. Ever had that idea? Raise your hand if you ever had that feeling. You're crazy. Give me a break. You think you're the only one in the universe? I'm the only one in the universe. I'm in bed right now. I'm just about to go to sleep. You are nothing but an uploaded memory. Now, is that possible? I will show the answer is yes. Last year, the first memory was successfully uploaded into a brain. I'll talk about that. Something that happened just last year. And then here's the former governor of California. That's what happens when you have a marriage uploaded into your memory. His marriage with Sharon Stone was uploaded into his memory, and there he is, okay, reacting to that. In fact, if you saw the movie, it's a very clever movie. Throughout the entire movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger is the good guy. You identify with him. He's the good guy battling the bad guys. Then at the very end of the movie, you find out that he's really the bad guy with all the good guy memories implanted into his mind. This is the only movie I'm aware of in which the hero and the villain are the same people. And then what about exoskeletons? Believe it or not, the United States Pentagon is dumping tens of millions of dollars to connect the mind to mechanical arms, legs, a complete exoskeleton. My colleague, Stephen Hawking, the great cosmologist, he now has lost control over all his bodily functions except his mind. We have now connected his mind to a laptop. Next time you see him on television, look at his right frame of his glasses. There's a chip and an antenna that picks up waves from his brain, decodes it, and allows him to communicate with the world. And so we're talking about brain-machine interface, one of the hottest fields now in neurology. And then people say, well, where do we have robots? Where's my robot maid? Where's my robot butler? Well, artificial intelligence turned out to be harder than we thought. But what about surrogates, avatars? They use a human brain wired up to control a perfect body. Avatars, you are placed in a pod and you control the motions of an organism, a living person, or maybe even a robot. Surrogates already exist. And the question is this the future of the space program? When we send into outer space robots that are cheap, they don't bellyache, they don't complain, they don't nag, and they don't have to come back. Controlled by astronauts sitting in their living room, mentally communicating with their surrogate. And then telekinesis. Telekinesis, the power to move objects with the mind. This is the movie Carrie, where a young girl who's telekinetic was abused by all her classmates. So in the final scene of the movie, she destroys the entire high school. What's the lesson here? The lesson here is never bring a telekinetic to the senior prom.
Dr. Michio Kaku is a theoretical physicist, best-selling author, and the host of Sci-Fi Science on the Science Channel. Doctor, good morning. Good to see you.
Good morning, man.
The president is saying basically this. Look, times are tough. There's a nasty recession out there. There's bloating at NASA. There's room to cut money here. Constellation is one good place. I know you agree with the assessment that there's room for cuts. You don't necessarily agree with the process.
Well, we need a leaner and meaner NASA. To put anything into outer space costs $10,000 a pound. That's your weight in gold. And in fact, to put an astronaut on the space shuttle costs $65 million per astronaut. So we all agree we got to bring down costs. But do we lop off an arm and a leg in the process? Or do we try to slim down and get more vigorous and innovative?
For 50 years or so, this country has been the leader in manned spaceflight. Now, as a result of the president's plan, do you think it's a necessary conclusion that we will no longer be the leader? Are we going to be second or third in that program?
We're just going to have to get used to the fact that we're going to be depending upon the Russians for access to outer space, and the Chinese have announced that they're going to go to the moon by 2020 or shortly afterwards. We're just going to have to get used to the fact that we're not going to be dominating the manned space program.
When you say get used to it, do you see any problems with hitching rides with the Russians or the Chinese, or by turning this over to private industry?
In the long term, no.